Welcome to part 2 of the module, Working with Killer Copy. In this portion of the module, you're going to be learning how to use copy and visuals together. Now before we get started, you need to understand that there are three basic layouts for print ads. We have on the left our verbal copy-driven strategy. Here you will see that the copy is actually the driving force behind this ad, and any visual elements you see are what we call indirect, meaning we can change out or swap out the images and they're going to have minimal impact on the overall message. They're mostly there to add aesthetic value and maybe support the message, but they're not reliant upon the copy. Next we have our visual driven, and this is where the copy is the supporting role, and really our ad is driven by the visual messages. So in this middle ad, the visual driven example, it's all about the luggage tags. Now of course the Bonvoy and Age that you see as part of the cities that belong to each of these luggage tags help communicate the overall message. Really it's the tags themselves that communicate this concept for Expedia. And then lastly we have our visual verbal, and this is where your headlines and your copies are really going to be directly related to your visuals. And in this, if you have one, you can't have you can't have one without the other, meaning if we were to take out the visual element, the verbal may not make as much sense, or vice versa. So you see here, these are what's called a direct relationship. Now one thing to keep in mind is it's important, no matter what visual strategy or what basic layout you use, that you're consistent throughout the entire campaign. If you've decided to use a visual only, as you see with the Lego on the left, then it's important that every execution of that campaign has that same visual only layout. Or if you decide to do something that's a visual verbal, as you see with the Volkswagen ad on the right, that you're consistent. Now, of course, with everything in advertising, especially on the creative side, it's okay to break rules every now and then. One of those are going to be in a transmedia campaign, which we'll cover later on in this semester. But be sure that you're keeping not only your visual layout and your basic layout the same, but you're keeping the strategy consistent throughout. If you're doing a visual copy, make sure that it's the same for the whole campaign. So here you see not only are the images and the copy very similar in their looks, they have the same tone. And what that does is it helps the reader or the viewer see and recognize your ad no matter where they're at, instead of constantly trying to re-evaluate and relearn what it is you're trying to communicate. It's important that you try different layouts during the rough draft stage. What's the most important thing that you want to communicate, and what's the best way of communicating that message? Is it a strong visual that'll help really communicate what you're trying to sell or influence and persuade? Or is it the copy? Do you have a really great tagline and a really great headline that's going to provoke thought and get people saying and talking about? And also, can you have one without the other? Like I said, I think the cream de la crop are the ads that have a really strong visual and use a direct relationship with the verbal elements, that if you remove one, you take away, you can't have one without the other. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, but when you do it well and you do it right, it's really effective. Now we've already briefly covered some headlines, but I'm going to get into a few finer nuances about when you're working with visuals. In this, we're going to talk about punctuation marks, the headline twist, using questions or headlines, and a double meaning. So first off, we want to avoid using unnecessary punctuation in any of our copy. Now I know this isn't directly related to the visual element quite yet, but what's important to know is that if you have a bunch of punctuation in your copy, it's going to immediately detract from and lessen the effect of your visuals, with the exception of a question mark. So use punctuation if necessary, but see if you can strip it down. So for example, on the right you see lung cancer, stomach cancer, bladder cancer, stroke, bad breath. They don't use commas throughout it, and they let it visually just be individual statements. So sometimes your copy doesn't have to have those visual elements that say it's a sentence, that it can just be quick statements. What leads us to our next point. Using headlines as questions. Sometimes it's really great and beneficial to use a headline as a question and then let the visual element or the preceding body copy answer that headline. So, for example, there's this really great classic ad by Volkswagen, and it said, "How does the man who drives a snowplow drive to the snowplow?" It's a common thought that no one ever stops to think about. Someone has to get up early and drive on the very crowded and cluttered roads. Living in Chicago, you notice that the streets are really clean and swept by 8 a.m. so morning traffic can get to work. But someone had to get there at 4 o'clock that morning and start it. And here in this great campaign, they answer that question, and Volkswagen owns it and says, it's the man who drives the Volkswagen that has the durable and dependable car that can make sure that you get to your job. Now, there's a couple things that you want to make sure that you avoid. Number one of them is avoiding yes/no questions in your headline copy. If you obviously say yes or no, it makes it much harder to give a visual element that will supply the correct answer. But also, if you say no right off the bat, you've eliminated half your audience. So, for example, if you were to ask, do you drive a Volkswagen? And the answer is no, I may not be inclined to continue reading because I think this ad isn't for me because I don't drive a Volkswagen. Now, yes/no can work if you make it impossible to give the wrong answer. So, for example, you can ask, do you breathe air? Well, everyone breathes air. Obviously, the answer is yes. So then you can continue on with your message. You can ask thought-provoking questions to use the art help the answer. So here, we actually have a lot of the copy that's driving the rest of that question for the Volkswagen ad. But you'll see later on that there'll be a question mark where the visual is the actual answer. For example, is it in you is very broad. Here they purposely leave it to where you can't give the wrong answer because it allows the user to say, what's in me? I don't know. Is it Gatorade or is it the inspiration and the heart to succeed? Here's an example of whose birthday is it anyways, and they let the art actually give you the answer. So if this is a direct relationship. If you were to remove those images and you just say whose birthday is it anyway, you're not really sure what the writer is referring to. But then by having this image of Santa Claus and then of Jesus, it really gets the message of Christmas. Whose birthday are we celebrating? And the pictures actually tell the story. And lastly, we have our got milk. This is, again, one of those great yes or no, but they've done a great job throughout this campaign of showing what happens if you don't have milk. And this is one of those rare instances where the obvious yes/no actually worked out to a benefit. And again, we want to try to avoid the answer any questions to answer with just a yes or no, because the minute you say no, you immediately eliminate half your audience. Let me give you some examples of how you can spice up the question. We want to involve people. If you give them an out too soon, you're going to lose them. So, if you are for a diamond ad and you're trying to get men to buy an engagement ring, this may not be an effective headline. Are you ready to propose? Obviously, there are going to be some men that say yes, and they may work for them. But there's going to be a lot of men who say, no, I'm not ready to propose, and they're not going to give your ad a second opinion. What if we slightly tweak that headline now to say, why haven't you proposed already? This actually invites the reader and encourages them to have a thought-provoking response and actually think about the answer. The second rule, we need to make it impossible to give the wrong answer. Make the answer so obvious in the ad so they have to either be a liar or they're not paying attention. Going on with this is asking the invoking question. And again, I use this as an example because I just love this ad. It's a great, simple way of showing a big headline that gets your attention and letting the visuals invoke the question and make people actually think about what it is they're celebrating, or in this case, for the Episcopal Church, getting them to consider religion around Christmas time. The answer is in the visual element. Here's some other very useful question marks in the headline where the answer is somewhat obvious, or they give you something to ponder. For the first one, they say, can you see the boat? The tagline then reads, not if you're doing it right. Obviously, you don't see a boat, and it's trying to imply that you need to be on the boat for this tour or this boat cruise. There's another one, if TV is so bad for you, why is one in every hospital room? Again, questions to ponder, very rhetorical question. And then we have The Economist, which again is known for their great headlines, which came first? And this goes back to those age-old questions of the chicken or the egg, right? Now, some questions have double meanings, and if you can figure out a way to have a double proposition with a double meaning, then that's another great strategy for success in your writing. Gatorade has built a great campaign on the Is It In You campaign, because it allows you to ask two questions. One, is the product in you? And then two, is the actual tenacity of the athlete in you? Now, we've talked about the headline twist, and I want to expand on this and show how the visuals can really help with this headline twist. And one of those methods is using a double meaning. Now, we want to try to avoid rhyming and puns, as I've already said, but it's okay if you have a homonym and then you use the visuals to support the different ways of saying that. So here we have for Evian water bottle, and they were trying to talk about it being a compactable bottle. And it says, get drunk and collapses. Now, obviously, we think about someone drinking alcohol and then falling down, but here they use that same sort of notion to show you that our water bottles, you can drink it down and then squish it down. Let me show you some other really great double meaning headlines, and that you can see these in newspapers and you'll see why they get people's attention. Marijuana issue sent to a joint committee. Obviously, there's a little bit of joke with that word joint. Republicans turned off by size of Obama's package. There's a little bit of if people understand how the phrase package is used outside of this context here, it's a little bit of humor in the headline and may get someone to read the rest of that ad or article. Here you can use the different types of words. This is actually from Britain. This is a campaign. The Labour Party is the side of the non-conservative, and you had leaders that were in the Labour Party, and they said Labour isn't working, meaning the Labour Party isn't working, but also the notion of labor and work being related to one another, saying, hey, you're not working. So a great crafty headline used here with an indirect visual. Obviously, we don't need to show people standing in a waiting line. It adds a little to effect and the aesthetics of it, but the headline itself largely works. Now, here's some other great examples of a headline-visual relationship where the headline is thought-provoking and asks a question, and it's the visual that tells the story. In this gun ad on the left, you see it says, one child is holding something that's been banned in America to protect them. And they then follow up and ask you, guess which one? And what's great about this ad is they show a child holding the Kinder Egg, and then one they show holding an assault rifle. And they ask you to think about and actually answer the question honestly, why is it that assault rifles have not been banned, but a Kinder Egg has? So you'll see this question where here they have an opportunity to invite you to debate and think about the answer. And they don't necessarily tell you the answer right away with the visuals, but they invite you to prod and think about it yourself. Now, when you're working with headlines and visuals, it's most important that you avoid the CSAY. And we're going to cover direct and indirect visual a little bit more, and we're going to talk about what the CSAY is. And we want to find ways that we can have a contrast and a contradiction between our headlines and our visuals. And this is probably the most important thing out of this portion of the lecture. So what are direct and indirect visuals? An indirect visual, and you've heard me mention this several times in this lecture so far, are generic, that the ad could actually do without that visual, and they could use the headline only, and they're not going to change the meaning. These visuals are just aesthetic in nature, or sometimes they're just a small supporting role that we can sub them out with ease, and it's not going to change. Now, the direct is the marriage between the visual and the headline. One wouldn't make sense without the other, and these are actually more interesting, and these are something that you want to try to use in your work. So here's a couple of examples. The one on the top left is a very indirect ad. The headline may, the visuals really lack interest. They just have a little bit of visual appeal to them, but they can stand alone. So you see the headline that says, what is the price of a bottle of wine? Don't drink and drive. Now here they've craftively used this broken glass to show a broken bottle, but we could have really subbed out any picture of a car accident, skid marks on the road, a hospital bed. We could have put anything in there and it would have answered the question. So there's not as strong as a direct relationship. Now, on the one on the below, though, here the headline is actually talking to this individual image, and it makes it much more direct. One doesn't stand without the other. The headline reads, which of these three kids is wearing Fisher-Price anti-slip roller skates? Well, they're actually talking about this image. Which of these three kids? We see the image, and what you cause the reader to pause and reflect and say, wait, I only see one kid. Oh, now I get it. It's because the other two fell down. So that's a direct relationship. Now, obviously, if you just saw this smug kid and you didn't see the other two kids, you didn't read this headline, you wouldn't know what this ad was for. So they have to exist with another. Here's another example of an indirect ad. It says, smart listens to the head, stupid listens to the heart. We see two people kissing on the road while they're driving, kind of being stupid, as the tagline says, be stupid. But we could pretty much show any picture of someone being stupid, and it's not going to change the meaning of an ad. Here we have something that's a little more direct. New acts anarchy for him and for her, and they let the visuals drive here. That without this headline or this tagline about the product, you wouldn't know what this ad was for. And you see the man with the electric, and you see the woman pumping the gas. Visually, you see the him and the her colors. So there's a lot that we can talk about in art direction next week. But the ad functions basically by using the Unleash the Chaos tagline along with those images. Now, most importantly, we must avoid CSA. This is what's called the C-spot run. When the headline and the visuals communicate the same thing. The visuals need to play off one another. So you can do this by having the headline introduce the visual, and the visual gives you something new or a bit of information. Or you can do it through a little bit of contrast and contradiction. So going back to this ad, here the headline introduces a topic and the visual provides an answer, but they're not saying, hey, is it Jesus' birthday or Santa Claus's birthday in the headline? Instead, they just say, whose birthday is it? So look for these small nuances. Now, here's an example of a direct headline where it introduces the visual. The headline is setting up the visual in this case. Rather than ask a question, it says, if you're embarrassed by a pimple, try explaining this. Now think about it. If we were to put any other image in there, it completely changes the meaning. This can quickly go from a pregnancy awareness ad for teen pregnancy to a drug ad by putting something else of someone dying of a drug overdose. So here what we can do is use the headline to set it up and then let the visual be something that's unexpected. If you find yourself stuck, see what happens if you take one of the elements out and it doesn't make much sense. That we call that reductionism, which we'll get into during the art direction lecture. I like to say that you want to have a little bit of contrast and contradiction. There's the old Laurel and Hardy comedy duo, and one played the straight man where all of his lines were straight and to the point, and the other one played the comedy relief or the shtick or the silly guy, the contrasting clown. And it was that relationship between the straight shooter and the sort of oddball that created the humor. Copy and visuals work a lot like that. If your headline is the clever, funny one, then your visual needs to be the more straight and serious. And inversely, if your headline is the straight and serious part, then let the visuals be the fun and sort of expressive portion of your ad. Make sure that they're both try to avoid them both being serious or both of them being silly. And again, this is some circumstances where they're both going to be serious. For if you're working with something like teen pregnancy, you're probably not going to want to make jokes out of it. So use some discretion here, but this is a great technique to get started with. You also want to avoid making both lines or statements negative. You need to have a positive meaning. Advertising, as much as it's about to make you think, we also want to get people to act. And the best way to get people to act is give them some sort of positive reward. And so if you're going to have a negative portion in there, make sure you end with something positive that gives them some hope or somewhere to look forward to and makes them feel good about it. And we want to avoid compelling visual with confusing, provoking headline. So keep your headline really simple and your visuals can be a little more complex, or vice versa. We don't want to have two straight, easy to understand visuals and headlines because then it's flat and boring. So if one's hard to understand, the other one should be simple and vice versa. The two should play off one another, and this can be accomplished just by rewriting the headline. So again, we have a very thought-provoking, intense image here of seeing a little girl holding an assault rifle with a very soft headline that says one child is holding something banned in America to protect them. Guess which one? Let's take it a step further and try some contrast to really drive it home. And this is what we call juxtaposition, where we put something that you don't normally think of when you're combining with another element. So here we have the image of a pregnant male. Now, we all know that men do not get pregnant, but they ask this thought-provoking question: would it be more careful if it was you that got pregnant? And here we have a direct ad. By showing the man, we actually know who our audience is. If you think about this, if they were to show just another woman, this would maybe change the message and ask people to maybe be more sensitive about the way they talk about teen pregnancy. But by showing a man, they're really trying to hit home the message that, hey, men, you're just as much at stake, and if you were the ones that get pregnant, you'd probably be a little more cautious about using care and caution. So here we use something unexpected with a great straight headline. And again, let me stress this enough. Powerful and unusual visuals, you need to have a straight understood headline. If you're using a straight understood visual, then have a powerful and unusual headline. So in sum, you need to know the difference between direct and indirect visuals. We need to avoid what's called CSAY, where the headline says one thing and then our visuals just show that exact same thing. It's sort of the see spot run, and then you actually see the dog running. We want to avoid, or we want to try using a headline that introduces a visual and have a contrast and a contradiction between your headlines and your visuals. What I'd like you to do for exercise 2, before you start demonstrating it, I want you to look around at ads and see if you can just identify a direct headline visual, or try to find something that's just a headline that uses copy to have that contrast that doesn't rely on the visuals, and see how the two contrasts compare and which one you like and dislike more. Which one do you find more engaging? And then what I want you to do is actually, for homework number 2, is an individual exercise where you're going to write copy. You go to tracks for assignment number 2, writing copy. You'll see all the instructions and the directions there. But in brief, you're going to be asked to write 3 copy-focused ads. One ad will be copy-driven long copy. Obviously, this will be an indirect visual, that any images or any visuals you use are just there for aesthetic and maybe subtle support. And really the meat of the ad is going to be about the copy that you use. The next is going to be a copy-driven short copy. So this is, again, our copy only. And the indirect visual, but rather than rely on long bodies of copy, I want to see if you can get a message with just a quick headline and a short tagline, or a quick headline and a short piece of body copy. Go back and refer to Module 1 for this if you need some more guidance. Also, the Berry chapter and the Prickin chapters provide some more examples. And then lastly, and most challenging, I want you to do a visual verbal short copy. And this is where your headline sets up something and the visual answers it. Good luck and have fun with it. This is going to be the first start of your ad campaigns that you're going to produce for this course.